Hello, and welcome to the Birthplace of Country Music Museum's virtual story time. I'm Renee Rogers, and today we are going to read you a story about our favorite man in black, and it's called Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. This book was written by G. Neri and illustrated by A.G. Ford. Special thanks to Penguin Random House, who gave permission for us to share this book with you. So let's get started. It's a good one. I think you'll enjoy it. Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. I'm bound for the promised land. Before he became Johnny Cash, he was simply called J.R., a name that stood for nothing, and nothing was all he had coming into this world. By the time he was 3, J.R.'s family was close to ruin, forced to flee southern Arkansas before the desperate winds of the Great Depression turned them all to dust. They hit the road searching for a better life, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a few belongings, and Mama's old beat-up guitar. It was on that bitterly cold journey north that J.R. sang his first song. Huddled next to his brothers and sisters in the back of a flatbed truck, J.R. sang aloud, his teeth clattering as Mama beat out the gospels on her guitar. I am bound for the promised land, they cried out, the wind howling all around them. Scared and hungry, J.R. asked, "Where is the promised land, Mama?" She smiled and said, 2 days north in a place called Dyes, where the mud of the Black Delta land was as thick as gumbo and the promise of the New Deal as good as gold. J.R. kept singing that song over and over, hoping and praying that promise would come true. 5 feet high and rising. Surrounded by a jungle of thickets and boulders, Dyes sure didn't look like the promised land. J.R. gazed out from their bare-bones house as Daddy, Brother Roy, and a stubborn mule busted their backs taming 20 acres of New Deal land. It would take months of blood, sweat, and tears to turn that tangled mess of scrub oak into fields of prickly white cotton. It was a hard life. Daddy, Mama, and the older kids were up at dawn and spent all day in the fields under the hot sun, hoeing, planting, weeding, and picking till their fingers bled. The work never stopped. His daddy was warned from the get-go, being a southern farmer is like walking a tightrope. One slip and you're doomed. To J.R., it seemed they were always slipping, fighting off deadly snakes and wildcats, battling to keep the mighty Mississippi from swallowing up their farm in the great flood of '37, losing entire crops to seasons of a drought and frost or plagues of army worms destroying everything in their path. It was tough on everyone. Things were there one day and gone the next. But Mama's guitar was always there to calm J.R.'s fears with its comforting sounds, until one day that disappeared too, sold to buy food or clothing, because music might feed the soul, but it couldn't feed the family. Far away places. Too young to work the fields, J.R. watched from the front porch as his family headed out to the cotton patch. He hated being by himself, so Daddy bought him a small, battery-powered radio to keep him company. From day one, J.R. was glued to that tiny speaker, amazed by the endless songs playing just for him. Beautiful music came out of that box, simple but heavenly. Guitar, bass, drums, and a voice. Those radio stations took him to faraway places, like Nashville, New Orleans, or Del Rio, Texas, playing songs about a world he'd never imagined before. Folk, blues, cowboy, gospel, and pop music. The radio had it all. To Mama's surprise, J.R. remembered all the songs he heard. He could sing Hobo Bill's Last Ride like Jimmy Rogers himself. Pretty soon the neighbors took notice, dropping by to hear him belt out a tune with his tiny voice. J.R. the human radio at just 5 years old. At bedtime, when Daddy told him to go to sleep, J.R. would press his ear to the speaker to catch the last few moments of a world free of cotton and mud. He dreamed that someday he'd fly away to those faraway places and write songs about them for the radio, so that some kid might hear them and dream a little bit too. Flesh and blood. Nobody was closer to J.R. than his big brother, Jack Dempsey Cash. He was only 2 years older, But since JR was so scrawny and shy, Jack became his protector, mentor, and best friend all rolled into one. Jack wasn't just strong like the boxing champ he was named after. He was a deep thinker, too. Like their granddaddy, the horseback preacher, he had the calling to teach the Bible. He taught JR right from wrong and about hard work and sacrifice. But he also knew how to have fun. Sharing secrets at the fishing hole, climbing trees like squirrels, or reading passages from Jack's dog-eared miniature Bible late into the night, the two were never apart. Jack was fearless. When Daddy drank too much and turned his anger on Mama and the kids, it was Jack who stood up to him. When JR found a stray dog and Daddy shot it because it killed 2 of their chickens, it was Jack who helped ease his pain. By the time JR was 8, he and Jack were working side by side, picking cotton with the rest of the family in the sweltering Arkansas heat. As he pulled his cotton sack along the darkened earth, JR sang, lifting everyone's spirits with his high voice. He sang novelty songs, folk and pop songs, and challenged his sister Louise to hum any tune and he'd guess it. JR knew them all. By late afternoon, when misery set in, he turned to gospel, stoking the last embers of fire in their bellies so they could fill their cotton sacks one more time before the skies grew dark. I came to believe. For a Southern Baptist boy, being saved at a church revival was a rite of passage, the first step toward accepting God into your life. But for JR, sitting in those church pews was terrifying. All that shouting and crying, gasping and praying. They sure didn't act like they were being saved from the devil. People broke out in fevers and shakes, and they threw their hands up in the air when the preacher yelled, "Repent, or the wrath of God will strike you down." JR would grab the pew in front of him, his knuckles turning white with fear. He was not without sin, sometimes stealing cigarettes and thinking bad thoughts, and watching the sky light up one night from a nearby grass fire. He felt like hell was coming for him. Music was the only thing that kept him going back. He loved the Gospels, with those soaring voices and angelic harmonies. For Jack, salvation meant the Bible. For JR, it was all about the music. When he was 12, JR answered the call to be saved. The music was so powerful, it just made him stand up and walk to the altar. When the preacher laid his hand on JR's forehead, a sense of peace washed over him. Afterward, he felt even closer to Jack, like somehow they were equals now. Before they were joined by blood, now they were spiritual brothers too. Meet me in heaven. It started off as a perfect spring day. One of those Saturdays where he and Jack would laze about, fishing under the weeping willows that lined the Taranza River. JR wanted Jack to come fishing, like they did most Saturdays, but times were tough, and Jack had a chance to earn some extra money for the family. Jack knew he should go to work, but he kept stalling. "I feel like something bad is going to happen," he said. JR tried to get Jack to change his mind, but couldn't stop him from going. Alone at the fishing hole, JR had a wretched feeling in his gut all morning. Hours later, when a black car headed his way, JR's heart skipped a beat. Daddy was in the passenger seat. "Leave the pole," he called out. "Jack's been hurt really bad." Daddy told him that Jack had fallen on a table saw while cutting fence posts. "I'm afraid we're going to lose him." It was the first time JR saw his daddy cry. At the hospital, the family gathered around, praying and crying. Jack opened his eyes one last time. "Can you hear the angels singing?" he said. "I'm going there, Mama." The day after they lowered Jack's body into the earth, the family had to work the fields. JR felt like he had died too. He thought if only he'd tried harder to stop Jack from going to work, he might have saved him. Watching Mama fall to her knees in the field with tears in her eyes was almost too much for him to bear. JR didn't know what to do, so he just started singing the spirituals from Jack's funeral, and Mama stopped crying to listen. JR kept singing all afternoon, letting his pain pour out through his high, strong voice, which carried for miles across the fields to the heavens above. Hurt. The music would protect him. After Jack's death, all JR talked about was his brother. But after a while, his friends got tired of hearing those stories, so JR just stopped talking about him altogether. Instead, he'd walk for miles alone, writing sad poems in his head. One day, JR found himself walking down by the fishing hole. He heard someone playing a perfect rhythm on the guitar and thought maybe it was a radio. Turned out it was a crippled boy playing in front of a rundown shack. JR had seen the kids make fun of this boy, whose hand and foot were deformed by polio. They laughed and imitated the way he limped into town. But JR didn't care a lick. The boy's music spoke to him. He was like some kind of magician, creating incredible sounds with that withered right hand. JR started dropping by at the end of every day to listen from across the road. After a few days, the boy invited him over. His name was Jesse Barnhill, and he loved music as much as JR did. He taught JR his first chord on the guitar. Jesse understood JR's sad poems and helped turn them into songs. They'd play late into the night, and for JR, it was pure heaven. On his long walks home, the wildcats growling in the darkness, JR sang out loud, knowing the music would protect him from all that was dark and scary in the world. One day, JR said, "You know, Jesse, you've got polio, but you sure can play." Jesse just shrugged. Sometimes when you lose a gift, you get another one. Oh, what a dream. The rest of the time, JR could be found hauling a 6-foot cotton sack through the fields. Hard work helped get his mind off Jack. On some days, he worked so hard, he ended up with 300 pounds of cotton. His one break in the day was lunch, but he usually had something other than food on his mind. The High Noon Roundup was the most talked about radio show in the Mid-South for one reason, the Leuven Brothers. Those country boys were considered the best duo ever, and hearing them got JR through many a day. When he found out they were coming to perform at the local high school, JR knew he had to go. He showed up 2 hours early, and when the brothers finally stepped onto the stage, it was like they'd walked right out of the radio and into JR's life. He wanted to tell them, "I'm going to be a singer on the radio someday too," but the music just left him speechless. Their rousing harmonies pushed the crowd to their feet, stamping with joy. In person, they were twice as good as on the radio. Sitting in the front row, JR felt every note washing over him. He was never happier. The pain and weariness from Jack's passing lifted, and after the show, he floated all the way home. That night, he couldn't sleep. He'd seen the future. It was a stage, and he knew that he belonged on it. Daddy thought that big dreams were a waste of time for a country boy. "You'll never be anything as long as you've got that music on your mind," he warned. But JR couldn't help it. He felt the music calling, like a voice from the middle of the earth, full of mystery and power, reaching up and grabbing hold of his heart. His brother Roy, who once dreamed of being in a band of his own, told him to follow his gut. "Someday you're going to be somebody. The world's your apple, and you're going to peel it." Can't help but wonder where I'm bound. Even though Daddy was against it, Mama kept encouraging JR to sing. It was the only time he seemed at peace after Jack's passing. She thought his music brought him closer to God, so she pushed him to perform in church, where his strong tenor voice rang out like the gospel truth. Folks listened eagerly, as moved by his singing as they had been by the voice of his granddaddy, the preacher, long ago. Mama wanted him to take singing lessons, thinking it might help his chances to succeed. She worked a whole day, doing other people's laundry to pay for the lesson. When the teacher asked JR to sing, she was stunned by the voice she heard. "Don't ever take voice lessons again," the teacher said. "Don't let me or anyone else change the way you sing." One hot summer day, after JR's 17th birthday, he and Daddy chopped wood for almost 12 hours straight. JR dragged himself home, singing as he always did after a hard day's work. Mama turned around, surprised. Who was that singing in such a low, booming voice? That was me, said JR, her eyes filled with tears. You sound exactly like your granddaddy. JR shouted out, Hey, my voice dropped. He was startled at how low he could sing. His voice was suddenly as smooth and deep as the Mississippi itself. Mama looked him straight in the eye. God has his hand on you, son, she said. You have the gift, and you'll be singing for the world someday. We'll meet again. JR's senior class trip gave him a taste of life outside Dahlia's. Music City, Nashville, Tennessee was like a dream to him. He'd heard and read so much about it that he couldn't sit still for the entire 250 miles they traveled. Not only were they headed for country's most famous stage, the Grand Ole Opry, but they would also be seeing his favorite vocal group, the Carter Family. Mama used to sing Carter Family songs when JR was small, and he loved them ever since. His favorite song, Can the Circle Be Unbroken, usually featured their youngest member, June Carter, who was barely older than him. The first time he ever heard her cracking jokes on the radio, JR laughed all day long. When he finally saw June in person from the balcony of the theater, JR was smitten. She was beautiful and could sing like nobody's business. He was suddenly struck with a feeling that sooner or later they'd be singing together on that very stage. From then on, he kept track of her travels, listening as she popped up on the radio from all over the country. He knew someday he'd catch up to her, and the day he was singing next to June Carter would be the day that he truly arrived. I'll fly away. After high school, dyes no longer held much for JR. Jack was gone, cotton was no longer king, and jobs were scarce. Once he tried to work in the auto plants up north, but he only lasted 3 weeks. Being cooped up on the assembly line was too much for a country boy. Stuck back home, JR dreamed of one day flying out of those cotton fields into the wild blue yonder. Daddy had traveled to all kinds of places with the Army, from New Mexico to fight off Pancho Villa, all the way to France to battle the Germans in World War I. For JR, the Air Force would be his ticket out. When the Korean War began, he joined up, giving himself the name John R. Cash because the military required a full name to enlist. During boot camp, his higher-ups discovered he had a special talent. They sent him to faraway Germany, where he found himself listening to the radio once again. Only this time it was serious business. Top secret, in fact. He was intercepting coded messages from the Russians. All those years of listening to every note of every song turned him into a master radio operator. John worked long hours, and to pass the time, he hummed along to the beat and the rhythm of the Morse code coming in over his headset. He imagined Mama's old guitar playing along too, and suddenly he knew what he needed to overcome his homesickness. John trudged through miles of blizzard to find what he was looking for, a cheap $5 guitar. He hugged it to his body and felt the warmth of the music it would bring. He remembered the few chords that Jessie had taught him and started playing. The sound of that guitar soon pulled in a few other lonely country boys from the base. They formed a band called the Barbarians because that's what their music sounded like to the Germans. But it didn't matter that they weren't any good. To John, playing together transported him from those bitterly cold nights to a warm summer's day way back home. I'm going to Memphis. After 4 years away, Staff Sergeant Cash came back to America a man. The first thing he did was marry a young woman who had literally knocked him off his feet in a roller skating rink back in Texas where he'd gone to boot camp. John had written Vivian Liberto the whole time he was away, the two of them falling in love by airmail. Reunited at last, they headed to Memphis, the place where he was about to change music forever. Needing money to start a family, John got a job selling refrigerators door to door, but his heart just wasn't in it. He spent most of his time dreaming and listening to the car radio. You're the worst salesman I've ever seen, said his boss. But he knew John had bigger ambitions than selling appliances. John had his heart set on his music, so his boss lent him money to pursue that dream. John was thankful. Someday I'm going to come back and repay you in full, he promised. One day, John heard a boom-chicka-boom sound coming from the back of the auto shop, where his brother Roy worked. It reminded him of the trains that used to rattle their childhood home. Some mechanic friends of Roy's, Luther and Marshall, were messing around on a guitar and a bass. John fell in with them, three dreamers in love with music. That train sound put them on a track, not to the local clubs where they were turned away for playing hillbilly music, but to church where they were invited to sing one Sunday night. They had no suits, and the only matching clothes they had were black. Black will be better for church anyways, John said. They walked up to the altar with their beat-up speakers and hand-me-down instruments, but the audience didn't care because as soon as John opened his mouth, it was like hearing the voice of God backed by bass and guitars. After that, John started wearing black all the time. Get rhythm. John was on his way to the grand opening of a new store in town when he heard screaming. He rushed to see what all the commotion was about, and when he turned the corner, he couldn't believe his eyes. Elvis Presley wasn't just singing on the back of a flatbed truck. He was gyrating like a tornado, whipping 300 girls into a frenzy with his music. John had never seen anything like it. That should be me, he thought jealously. Later, John sought out Elvis and was surprised to find a soft-spoken country boy just like himself, with a love of gospel music to boot. Soon they were trading licks on guitar. Say, what do you call that music you were playing? Asked John. Rock and roll, said Elvis. He and his producer, Sam Phillips, both loved the beat of the blues and the soul of country music. They mixed it all together and came up with a new sound. John wanted some of that magic. Soon after, John started showing up at Sun Records, where he pestered Sam Phillips into listening to him sing. For 2 hours, John sang every country and gospel tune he knew from the radio. Unimpressed, Sam said, "Sing something you wrote." John remembered a song he had written while waiting for the train to bring him home from the Air Force. When he let loose with "Hey, Porter," When he let loose with "Hey, Porter," Sam was moved. That deep thunder of his voice and the ache in his lyrics made the song believable and true. "That's the one. That's going to be a record," said Sam. John only had a few cents left to his name, but afterwards he was so happy that when a panhandler stuck out his hand, John gave him all that he had. Folks out on the road. It had been quite a year since John returned from Germany. Here he was, not only about to become a real singer, but a dad as well. A month before his first record came out, Vivian gave birth to their first daughter, Roseanne. Strumming lullabies to his baby at night, John felt like maybe God did have his hand on him. A few weeks later, he was driving on the highway when "Hey, Porter" came on the radio. He almost drove off the road. John couldn't believe that was his voice going out over the airwaves. He thought about all the songs he'd heard on the radio that had given him hope, calmed his despair, or just let him escape his troubles for a few moments. He looked at the cars around him and wondered if maybe they were listening to that same station and finding strength and inspiration through his music now. His first royalty check came in for $6.42. It wasn't much, but he felt like the richest man in town. When fan mail started to trickle in, John would lay the letters on the floor and marvel at all the different states they came from. What a world he lived in, singing and getting paid for it too. I walked the line. Sam thought John needed a little extra flash, so he started calling him Johnny, and the name stuck. Marshall and Luther became his band, the Tennessee Two, driving that boom-chicka-boom sound behind all his songs. At his first big show opening for Elvis, Johnny Cash stood out from the get-go. He didn't sing that sugary country music like the guys who wore glittery cowboy outfits. He wore black, and his voice had a raw power that penetrated the heart of anyone who heard it. That night, all of Johnny's family and friends watched as he set the stage on fire with an energy that left the crowd hungry for more. The audience kept calling him back for an encore, and after singing his 2 songs again and again, he finally broke out a new one, Folsom Prison Blues. The crowd went crazy for it. Johnny was overwhelmed. Afterward, one of his radio heroes, Sonny James, took him aside. "Looks like you've got it made, but remember, what you are and the life you live sings louder than any song." Johnny never forgot that. It made him want to write a song about who he was and how he wanted to live his life. The song would be a vow to stay true to his heart and to the family he loved. The words just poured out. In 20 minutes, Johnny Cash had written the biggest song of his life. When I Walk the Line became the #1 country song in America, Johnny went back to the boss who had lent him money to pursue his dreams, and he paid him back in full. The Man in Black. "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," is how he started every concert from then on. That simple statement said it all. Johnny Cash, the poor country boy from the cotton fields, traveled the world many times over, where he sang for presidents and the homeless, businessmen and farmers, soldiers and prisoners alike. It didn't matter how famous he got, he never forgot what it felt like to be cold, miserable, and hungry. Mama didn't have to remind Johnny that his gift was special. He knew he was not its owner, but its caretaker. "I'll always be true to it," he promised her. Being true meant being unafraid to speak from the heart. Just as Jack had believed in right from wrong, the Man in Black believed his role was to sing the truth, whether it was popular or not. His songs gave a voice to the voiceless, capturing so many people's heartaches, struggles, and triumphs. It seemed like he spoke for America, just as America spoke to him. For almost 40 years, he crisscrossed this great land as his concerts took him down every major highway to cities big and small. But it was only after he'd written 1,000 songs, sung 10,000 shows, and sold over 50 million records that Johnny Cash came to believe that the Promised Land was not a place in Dyes, Arkansas, or Landsberg, Germany, or Memphis, Tennessee. It was the feeling he got in his heart every time he shared his gift. And that's the end of the book. But if you do have a copy of this book, you can learn more about Johnny Cash and important moments in his lifetime, but also get a great list of songs to listen to at the back. We hope you enjoyed Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. It's one of our favorites, and I hope that it's become one of your favorites too. And most of all, I hope it's made you want to read more and more books. A big thank you for being with us today, but also for your support of the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. We'll be back on February 5th with a new book to read together. Hope to see you then. Thank you.